Easy Explain Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill, chapters 1 and 2. So chapter 1 is just general remarks. I think one of the biggest things to pull from this is when Mill summarizes Kant's ethical theory, right? Because that's going to be the starting point. That's really what we're going to be arguing against as we move into Mill's ethical theory of utilitarianism. So for Mill, Kantian ethical theory is, so act that the rule on which thou actest would admit of being adopted as a law by all rational beings. Right, so here we're just really summarizing and tapping back into the universal moral law put forward by Kant, right? You should do that, something that if everybody did it, everything would still be okay, right? The whole world wouldn't collapse. But let's move into chapter 2, and this is really where Mill starts to highlight what utilitarianism is. Starting with the greatest happiness principle. Again, this is pulling from a lot of his teachings he got from his tutelage under Jeremy Bentham. But let's see how Mill sums up the GHP. So he says, the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Pretty straightforward, right? The greatest happiness principle, whatever yields the greatest amount of happiness to the most amount of people. Very loose definition on happiness. Things that are pleasurable and not painful, right? It's almost Epicurean in a sense. Think of pleasure very, very broadly. And let's look at this example that Mill has of the foolish pig. A bit of a thought experiment here. Mill says it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it's because they only know their side of the question. The other part to the comparison knows both sides. So here he's saying, even if you are unhappy, right, we still, as humans, we're already better off, right? Just having some knowledge, some intelligence, some wisdom here. We don't want to be pigs. We don't want to be fools. We're already starting off in a pretty good spot. That being said, let's look at the utilitarian standard, right? We do need to be starting somewhere. So Mill says, for the utilitarian standard is not the agent's own greatest happiness, but the greatest amount of happiness altogether. We got to think big. We got to think socially. And if it may possibly be doubted whether a noble character is always the happier for its nobleness, there can be no doubt that it makes other people happier, and that the world in general is immensely a gainer by it. So here, right, we're starting to shift our focus to ethics, right? Not only how we should live, but how everyone should live, especially being as a functioning part contributing to society, right? So let's look at utilitarianism a little more generally defined. Mill goes on to say that utilitarianism, therefore, could only attain its end by the general cultivation of nobleness of character, even if each individual were only benefited by the nobleness of others, and his own, so far as happiness is concerned, were a sheer deduction from the benefit. But the bare enunciation of such an absurdity as this last renders refutation superfluous. So here he's starting to make an argument for why it's not just always about what you're doing, but it's really about the benefits of the masses, right? And now we're about to tie this directly back into the greatest happiness principle. A little bit longer passage here. I do think it's a good one, though. Broke it up into a few smaller parts. So Mill says, according to the GHP, as above explained, the ultimate end with reference to and for the sake of which all other things are desirable, whether we are considering our own good or that of other people, there it is, right? It's twofold here, is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain, and as rich as possible in enjoyments, both in point of quantity and quality. A lot to consider here. I really think Mill is covering a lot of bases. Let's keep going with the same passage, though. Mill says, he continues, the test of quality and the rule for measuring it against quantity, being the preference felt by those who in their opportunities of experience, to which must be added to their habits of self-consciousness and self-observation, are best furnished with the means of comparison. Let's just keep going right now. He says, this being, according to the utilitarian opinion, the end of human action is necessarily also the standard of morality, which may accordingly be defined, the rules and precepts for human conduct, by the observance of which an existence such as has been described might be, to the greatest extent possible, secured to all mankind, and not to them only, but so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole sentient creation. So here he really blows it out to not just be the way that you should live for yourself. It's got to be for everybody, for every human in society. This is the new standard of morality. This is how everyone should act for the benefit of all of us. But also not just us, for all of nature, right? We can extend this to everything that's sentient, to even how we interact with other animals and other life forms on Earth. Let's consider another slightly longer one, focused in on this utilitarian morality. Mill says, to do as you would be done by, and to love your neighbor as yourself, constitute the ideal perfection of utilitarian morality, his application of the golden rule. As the means of making the nearest approach to this ideal, utility would enjoin, first, that laws and social arrangements should place the happiness, or, as speaking practically, it may be called, the interest of every individual as nearly as possible, in harmony with the interest of the whole. So if you're actually doing this and you're doing this right, things are going to be harmonious, right? Everyone's going to be happy. Everyone's going to have the greatest amount of happiness. And secondly, that education and opinion, which have so vast a power over human character, should so use that power as to establish in the mind of every individual an indissoluble association between his own happiness and the good of the whole, especially between his own happiness and the practice of such modes of conduct, negative and positive, as regard for the universal happiness prescribes. So that, end of the passage here, not only he may be unable to conceive the possibility of happiness to himself, consistently with conduct opposed to the general good, but also that a direct impulse to promote the general good may be in every individual one of the habitual motives of action, and the sentiments connected therewith may fill a large and prominent place in every human being's sentient existence. Huge words here, really big. He's tying it all together about why this is the best for everyone as possible, especially if it's done properly. And this should be your motive, right? You should be acting for the good of everyone. You should want to do that. That's the moral attitude here. That is the utilitarian morality. And one last thing here, tie it full circle back to the beginning of chapter 2, or even chapter 1, when he outset against Kant. Here a little bit more explicitly, to wrap up chapter 2, Mill is going to say there is no case of moral obligation, that's Kant, right, in which some secondary principle is not involved. And if only one, there can seldom be any real doubt which one it is, in the mind of any person by whom the principle itself is recognized. Here he's starting to get into the argument that he will continue as we keep going with utilitarianism, that if we consider Kant's duty idea, right, this duty ethics, that you should do the right thing all the time no matter what happens, Mill's saying that, what is Kant even saying here? Kant, he doesn't even realize it, but he's actually a utilitarian. This is the first seed of that argument. We're going to see that more as we continue, but for now, this is largely what's covered in chapter 2, and I hope it helps.